At 16:20 hours on February 26, 1991, Captain H.R. McMaster's tank crested a low rise in the Iraqi desert. Through the swirling sandstorm, his thermal sight revealed a nightmare. Directly ahead, dug into fighting positions along a ridge, sat an entire brigade of Iraqi Republican Guard tanks. Their turrets were pointed south. They had not seen him coming. McMaster had perhaps 3 seconds before the enemy realized their flank was exposed. He gave the only order that made sense: fire. His gunner, Staff Sergeant Craig Koch, laid the crosshairs on the nearest T-72 and squeezed the trigger. The 120mm main gun roared. Before the shell casing hit the turret floor, Koch was already acquiring the second target. That tank exploded 8 seconds after the first. 9 American M1A1 Abrams tanks had just stumbled into a defensive position held by dozens of Soviet-made T-72s, the pride of the Iraqi Republican Guard. What happened over the next 23 minutes would stun military observers around the world, particularly those in Moscow who had built the T-72 and believed it capable of destroying anything the Americans could field. 28 Iraqi tanks would be reduced to burning hulks. 16 armoured personnel carriers would be torn apart. 30 trucks would be obliterated. And when the dust settled and the fires died down, not a single American soldier from Eagle Troop would be dead or wounded. The Battle of 73 Easting, named for an obscure grid line on a military map, would later be called the last great tank battle of the 20th century. It validated decades of American military doctrine developed in the shadow of the Cold War. It exposed critical weaknesses in Soviet tank design that had been hidden for years behind propaganda and secrecy. And it launched the career of a young captain who would one day become National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. But to understand how 9 tanks achieved what military theorists had considered impossible, you have to understand what brought them to that barren stretch of desert in the first place. The Cold War had defined American military planning for more than 4 decades. From the moment Soviet tanks rolled into Eastern Europe in 1945, American strategists had obsessed over a single nightmare scenario: thousands of Soviet tanks pouring through the Fulda Gap in Germany, overwhelming NATO defences, and reaching the English Channel before reinforcements could arrive. The numbers were terrifying. The Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies possessed more than 50,000 tanks. NATO had perhaps 15,000. In any conventional war, the Soviets would enjoy numerical superiority of 3 to 1 or more. American planners knew they could not match the Soviet Union tank for tank. They needed a different approach. That approach came to be known as air-land battle doctrine, developed in the late 1970s and formally adopted in 1982. Air-land battle represented a fundamental shift in how the United States Army planned to fight. Rather than trading shots with Soviet tanks in static defensive positions, American forces would use superior mobility, advanced technology, and aggressive maneuver to strike deep into enemy formations, disrupting their command and control, severing their supply lines, and destroying their combat power before it could be brought to bear. The doctrine required new equipment. The M60 Patton tank that had served since the 1960s was no longer sufficient. American engineers began work on a revolutionary new main battle tank that would combine unprecedented firepower, protection, and mobility. They named it after General Crichton Abrams, one of the finest tank commanders in American history. During World War II, Abrams had led the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armoured Division across Western Europe. His unit was often the spearhead of General George Patton's 3rd Army. Patton himself, never one to praise subordinates lightly, called Abrams the world champion of tank warfare. Abrams exemplified the aggressive, mobile style of armoured warfare that American doctrine would later enshrine. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, When German forces surrounded the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, it was Abrams who led the relief column that broke through the enemy encirclement. He commanded from the front, riding in a Sherman tank he named Thunderbolt. By the end of the war, he had gone through 7 tanks bearing that name, each one destroyed in combat while he somehow survived. After the war, Abrams continued to rise through the ranks. He commanded the 63rd Tank Battalion in Germany, then served as Chief of Staff for 3 different corps in Korea. In the early 1960s, he commanded the 3rd Armoured Division in Germany during some of the tensest years of the Cold War. He was promoted to general in 1964 and eventually took command of American forces in Vietnam in 1968. Abrams died of lung cancer in September 1974 while serving as Army Chief of Staff. He was only 59 years old. The Army honoured his memory by naming its new main battle tank after him when the XM-1 entered service in 1980. The M1 Abrams would become the most formidable tank in the world. The development of the Abrams had not been easy. In the 1960s, the United States and West Germany had attempted to jointly develop a new main battle tank called the MBT-70. The project was plagued by cost overruns and disagreements between the two nations. It was eventually cancelled in 1971 after consuming more than $300 million without producing a viable tank. American designers learned from this failure. The new XM-1 program focused on achievable goals rather than revolutionary technology. Chrysler Defense won the competition to build the tank, and production began at the Lima Army Tank Plant in Ohio. The first M1 tanks entered service in 1980, equipped with a 105mm rifled gun, adapted from the proven Royal Ordnance L7 design. What made the original M1 revolutionary was not its gun, but its armour. American designers had gained access to a new composite armour technology developed in Britain, known as Chobham Armour, after the research facility where it was created. This armour combined layers of ceramics, steel, and other materials to provide protection far superior to conventional steel plate at a fraction of the weight. The gas turbine engine that powered the Abrams represented another leap forward. Producing 1,500 horsepower, it gave the 68-ton tank a top speed of more than 45 miles per hour on roads and excellent cross-country mobility. The engine's multi-fuel capability meant the tank could run on diesel, kerosene, or jet fuel, simplifying logistics in the field. By the mid-1980s, American designers had identified the need for a more powerful main gun. Soviet tanks were being fitted with increasingly sophisticated armor, and the 105mm gun was reaching the limits of its penetration capability. The solution came from Germany, where Rheinmetall had developed a superb 120mm smoothbore cannon for the Leopard 2 tank. The original M1 mounted a 105mm rifled gun, adequate for its time but soon overtaken by advances in Soviet armor. In 1985, the M1A1 entered production. This upgraded variant carried a 120mm smoothbore cannon, manufactured under license from the German company Rheinmetall. The same gun armed the Leopard 2, which many considered the finest tank in NATO's arsenal. But firepower alone did not make the Abrams exceptional. Its true advantage lay in what American tankers could see. The M1A1 carried a thermal imaging system that allowed crews to detect heat signatures at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters. On a clear day, an Abrams gunner could identify and engage an enemy tank more than 2 miles away. At night, in fog, through smoke and dust, the thermal sight cut through conditions that would have blinded earlier generations of tankers. Soviet tanks possessed no equivalent capability. The T-72, which formed the backbone of both the Soviet Armored Force and the Iraqi Republican Guard, relied on optical sights and older infrared systems that required floodlights to illuminate targets at night. These active systems announced the tank's position to anyone watching. The passive thermal sights on American tanks remained invisible. Range compounded the advantage. The T-72's 125mm main gun had an effective range of approximately 2,000 meters against moving targets. The Abrams could kill at 2,500 meters or more. This meant American tanks could destroy their opponents before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The soldiers who would crew these tanks trained relentlessly throughout the 1980s. Stationed in West Germany, American armored units conducted exercise after exercise in the rolling terrain where they expected to meet Soviet forces. They practiced night operations. They drilled on gunnery ranges until their crews could engage multiple targets in seconds. They studied Soviet tactics and equipment until they knew the enemy as well as they knew themselves. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment was among the most experienced of these units. Based in Nuremberg, the regiment had patrolled 731 kilometers of the Iron Curtain since the 1950s. For 4 decades, its soldiers had watched the border between freedom and tyranny, prepared to be the first Americans to fight if the Cold War turned hot. The regiment's mission during the Cold War was as demanding as any in the American military. Soldiers rotated through 6 border camps, spread along the frontier with East Germany and Czechoslovakia. From these austere outposts, they conducted round-the-clock surveillance of the communist bloc. Vehicle patrols and helicopter observation missions mapped every movement on the other side of the wire. The border itself was a terrifying monument to totalitarianism. Multiple fences topped with barbed wire, minefields, guard towers with interlocking fields of fire. The East German and Czech border guards were carefully selected for political reliability and trained to shoot anyone attempting to escape to the west. Successful escapes were rare, typically fewer than 25 per year in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment sector. If the Soviets ever attacked, the regiment's job was to be a tripwire and a delaying force. They would make first contact with enemy armor, identify the main axis of advance, and fight a series of desperate holding actions while the heavier divisions behind them prepared for the decisive engagement. It was understood that casualties in these initial battles would be severe. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 changed everything. Regular border patrols were discontinued on March 1, 1990. The Cold War mission that had defined the regiment for 4 decades was suddenly obsolete. Officers and soldiers wondered what role they would play in a world that no longer needed them to watch the Iron Curtain. They did not have to wait long for an answer. Among the young officers who served in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment was a 28-year-old captain from Philadelphia named Herbert Raymond McMaster. Born on July 24, 1962, McMaster had graduated from West Point in 1984. His father had served as an enlisted soldier during the Korean War, before being commissioned as an officer during Vietnam. Military service was the family tradition. McMaster was assigned to command Eagle Troop, 2nd Squadron, and 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. His troop consisted of 140 soldiers organized into 2 tank platoons and a scout platoon. They operated 9 M1A1 Abrams tanks and 12 M3 Bradley cavalry fighting vehicles. It was a small command, but McMaster trained his soldiers with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He believed that leadership meant more than giving orders. It meant understanding the soldiers who would execute those orders, knowing their capabilities and limitations, and preparing them for the chaos of combat before they ever faced an enemy. His men came to respect him for his competence and his willingness to share their hardships. McMaster worked closely with the squadron operations officer, Major Douglas McGregor, to develop rigorous training programs. They conducted live fire exercises at the Grafenruhe Training Center in Germany, where crews practiced engaging multiple targets under realistic conditions. Night operations received particular emphasis. since American thermal sights provided their greatest advantage in darkness. The training was not without incident. During one large-scale night exercise in early 1990, McMaster's tank collided with a Bradley fighting vehicle that had become disoriented in the darkness. The Bradley's gun tube speared the engine compartment of the Abrams, disabling it. McMaster confirmed there were no casualties, arranged for maintenance personnel to recover the damaged vehicles, and continued the exercise as if nothing had happened. It was a close call that could have ended his career before the war began. When Saddam Hussein's forces invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990, the world that McMaster and his soldiers had prepared for suddenly shifted. The enemy would not be Soviet tanks pouring through the Fulda Gap. It would be Iraqi tanks occupying a small oil-rich nation on the Persian Gulf. Iraq possessed the fourth largest army in the world. More than 1 million men served in its armed forces. Saddam Hussein had spent the 1980s fighting a brutal war with Iran, and his military had emerged from that conflict battle, hardened and well-equipped with Soviet weapons. The Iraqi army operated approximately 5,500 tanks, including more than 1,000 T-72s, concentrated in the elite Republican Guard divisions. The Republican Guard represented the best Iraq had to offer. Originally formed as a palace guard to protect Saddam Hussein, the force had expanded during the Iran-Iraq War into a core-sized element of the most loyal and capable soldiers in the Iraqi military. Republican Guard divisions received the newest equipment, the best training, and preferential treatment in every respect. They were Saddam's iron fist. During the invasion of Kuwait, Republican Guard divisions had spearheaded the attack. The 1st Hammurabi Armored Division, the 2nd Al-Madina Al-Munawwara Armored Division, the Tawakkalna ala Allah Mechanized Division, and the Nebuchadnezzar Motorized Infantry Division had swept aside Kuwaiti resistance in less than 2 days. It was a display of military power that impressed observers around the world. After securing Kuwait, the Republican Guard divisions were pulled back into strategic reserve positions in southern Iraq. Regular Iraqi army units took over the defense of Kuwait itself. The Republican Guard would be held back to counterattack any coalition force that broke through the forward defenses. This was the same role they had played during the war with Iran. Among the Republican Guard formations was the Tawakkalna ala Allah Mechanized Infantry Division. The name meant trust in God in Arabic. The Tawakkalna had fought with distinction during the war with Iran and was considered one of the most powerful divisions in the Iraqi army. It fielded approximately 14,000 soldiers, 220 T-72 tanks, 284 infantry fighting vehicles, and 126 artillery pieces. The division was organized into 3 brigades: the 9th Armored Brigade, the 18th Mechanized Brigade, and the 29th Mechanized Brigade. Each brigade was a formidable formation in its own right, capable of independent operations against most regional opponents. Together, they represented a concentration of combat power that coalition planners could not ignore. The T-72 tanks that equipped the Tawakkalna division were among the most capable in the Iraqi infantry. Based on Soviet designs from the early 1970s, the T-72 mounted a 125mm smoothbore gun fed by an automatic loader. This autoloader reduced the crew to 3 men and allowed a rate of fire that Soviet designers believed would overwhelm enemy defenses. But the T-72s exported to Iraq were not identical to those retained for Soviet use. The export versions lacked some of the most advanced armor packages and fire control systems available to Soviet frontline units. Iraqi crews had also not received the intensive training that Soviet tankers underwent. These limitations would prove critical when they faced American armor. In September 1990, the United States began deploying forces to Saudi Arabia under Operation Desert Shield. The mission was to deter further Iraqi aggression and, if necessary, to liberate Kuwait by force. The 7th Corps, the primary American heavy force in Germany, received orders to move to the Persian Gulf. This deployment represented the largest movement of American military forces since World War II. Ships carried thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces across the Atlantic and through the Suez Canal to Saudi ports. Aircraft transported soldiers and critical equipment. The logistics alone was staggering. By the time the ground war began, more than 500,000 American service members would be in theatre. The 2nd Armoured Cavalry Regiment arrived in Saudi Arabia in early December 1990. For the next 2 months, McMaster and his soldiers conducted intensive training in desert warfare. The terrain was nothing like Germany. There were no forests, no hills, no landmarks of any kind. Navigation required new skills. The heat and sand created challenges their equipment had never faced. Desert operations demanded constant maintenance. Sand infiltrated engines, transmissions, and fire control systems. Air filters clogged within hours. Tracks wore faster on the abrasive terrain. Crews learned to check and clean their equipment multiple times daily, a routine that would prove essential when they entered combat. McMaster used this time to refine his tactics and strengthen the bonds within his unit. He addressed his soldiers before one training exercise with words that captured the moment. "Men, we must take very seriously what we are about to do. It is possible that the next operations order I give will be in the sands of Iraq." The air campaign began on January 17, 1991. For 38 days, coalition aircraft pounded Iraqi military targets. Strategic bombing destroyed command and control facilities, communications networks, and weapons plants. Tactical strikes targeted the Republican Guard divisions that would be the objective of the ground campaign. The Iraqi army suffered grievously under this bombardment. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers. Those who remained endured constant fear of attacks they could neither predict nor prevent. Morale collapsed in many units. By the time the ground war began, some Iraqi formations had lost half their strength to desertion and air attacks. The Republican Guard fared better than regular army units. Their positions in southern Iraq were harder to locate and target. They maintained better discipline and higher morale. But even the elite units could not escape the effects of weeks of bombing. Ammunition stocks were depleted. Vehicle maintenance deteriorated. The offensive spirit that had characterized the invasion of Kuwait gave way to a defensive mentality focused on survival. The ground war began on February 24, 1991. General Norman Schwarzkopf's campaign plan called for a massive flanking maneuver. While Marine forces and Arab coalition units attacked directly into Kuwait, the heavy armored divisions of 7 Corps would sweep around to the west, driving deep into Iraq before turning east to strike the Republican Guard from an unexpected direction. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment led the advance. Their mission was to find the enemy, fix him in place, and allow the heavy divisions following behind to deliver the killing blow. It was the traditional cavalry role, reconnaissance and screening, updated for the age of thermal sights and satellite navigation. For 3 days, the regiment pushed through empty desert, encountering only scattered resistance from Iraqi security forces. They took prisoners by the hundreds as demoralized enemy soldiers surrendered rather than fight. It seemed almost too easy. Then came February 26th. The day began with fog and rain, unusual weather for the Iraqi desert. By afternoon, a sandstorm had reduced visibility to 400 meters or less. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment pressed forward nonetheless, using thermal sights to penetrate the Merc and commercial GPS receivers to navigate the featureless terrain. At approximately 1500 hours, squadron commanders received orders to advance to the 70 Easting, a north-south grid line that served as a phase line to control the regiment's movement. McMaster gathered his troop and issued his attack order with enthusiasm. "We attack in 5 minutes to the 70 Easting. This is the moment we have all awaited." Eagle Troop moved out with its 2 tank platoons forward and scouts trailing. The sandstorm swirled around them, limiting visibility but also concealing their approach. At approximately 1610 hours, the lead elements received fire from an Iraqi infantry position in a cluster of buildings. McMaster's tanks and Bradley's returned fire, suppressing the enemy and taking prisoners before continuing east. What McMaster did not know was that his troop had just entered the security zone of the Tawakalna division. The main defensive positions lay just ahead, oriented to the south to meet an attack that the Iraqis expected to come from that direction. They had no idea that American forces were approaching from the west. At 1620 hours, McMaster's tank crested the subtle rise in the terrain that the Iraqis had chosen for their defensive line. His thermal sight revealed the heat signatures of dug-in tanks stretching across his field of view. The enemy was close, within killing range, their flanks completely exposed. McMaster reacted instantly. He ordered his gunner to engage and transmitted a contact report to squadron headquarters. The first T-72 exploded, then the second, then the third. His two tank platoons came online beside him, their gunners already acquiring targets. The Iraqis were caught completely by surprise. Their tanks were positioned to defend against an attack from the south, and they could not traverse their turrets fast enough to engage the Americans appearing on their flank. Those few tanks that did manage to fire found their rounds falling short or missing entirely. The T-72's fire control system was simply not capable of engaging targets at the ranges the Abrams crews were achieving. The thermal imaging disparity proved decisive. McMaster's gunners could see clearly through the sandstorm, while the Iraqi crews were effectively blind. American tank rounds struck T-72 after T-72 with devastating effect. The Soviet-designed tanks had a critical vulnerability. Their autoloader stored ammunition in a carousel beneath the turret, surrounding the crew compartment. When an American round penetrated the armor, it often ignited this ammunition, causing catastrophic explosions that blew the turrets completely off the hulls. This phenomenon would later become known among Western military observers as the Jack-in-the-Box effect. When a round penetrated a T-72's armor and reached the ammunition carousel, the resulting explosion was almost invariably fatal to the entire crew. Unlike American and British tanks, which stored their ammunition in separate compartments with blowout panels designed to direct the force of any explosion away from the crew, the T-72's design concentrated its ammunition in the worst possible location. The American M129A1 armor-piercing round was particularly devastating against Iraqi armor. This kinetic energy penetrator consisted of a long rod of depleted uranium, a material more dense than steel, traveling at nearly 1 mile per second. The round did not explode on impact. Instead, it punched through armor by sheer velocity and mass, creating temperatures inside the target that ignited fuel, ammunition, and anything else combustible. Eagle Troop advanced through the first defensive line, destroying everything in its path. Burning tanks and personnel carriers marked their progress. Iraqi infantry who attempted to resist were cut down by machine gun fire or suppressed by the Bradleys following the tanks. Those who surrendered were bypassed for follow-on forces to collect. The Bradley fighting vehicles proved nearly as deadly as the tanks. Although their 25mm Bushmaster cannons could not penetrate T-72 frontal armor, the Bradleys carried TOW anti-tank missiles capable of killing any tank in the Iraqi infantry. Bradley crews also used their thermal sights to identify enemy infantry positions, directing tank fire against targets their machine guns could not reach. At one point during the battle, McMaster sent a scout platoon of 2 Bradleys north to regain contact with Ghost Troop, which was fighting its own battle in the adjacent sector. These scouts encountered another Iraqi tank position containing 13 T-72s. Despite being equipped only with TOW missiles and their Bushmaster cannons, the 2 Bradleys engaged this superior force. 1 TOW misfired, requiring the crew to reload the launcher while under fire from the enemy tanks. Despite this malfunction, the 2 Bradleys destroyed 5 T-72s before other American units arrived to finish the engagement. McMaster pushed beyond the 70 easting line, the designated limit of advance. His executive officer, Lieutenant John Gifford, called on the radio to remind him of the boundary. McMaster replied that he could not stop while still in contact with the enemy. To halt now would surrender the initiative and give the Iraqis time to organize a counterattack. The tactical situation demanded continued aggression. 3 kilometers east of the original limit of advance, McMaster encountered another defensive position. More T-72 tanks in prepared fighting positions. More Iraqi soldiers waiting to die. His troop engaged this second line with the same efficiency that had destroyed the first. The battle was becoming a systematic annihilation of the enemy force. By 16:43 hours, 23 minutes after the first shot, McMaster declared the situation stable enough to halt his advance. Eagle Troop had destroyed 28 tanks, 16 personnel carriers, and 30 trucks. They had killed hundreds of Iraqi soldiers and captured many more. Not a single American had been killed or wounded. Not a single Abrams had been knocked out. The fighting continued throughout the evening as other troops from the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment engaged elements of the Tawakalna Division across the regimental front. Ghost Troop to the north and Iron Troop to the south fought their own desperate battles against Iraqi armour. The Iraqis attempted to reinforce their crumbling line, sending the 9th Armoured Brigade forward to counterattack. This fresh formation was destroyed as thoroughly as the units that had preceded it. By the time darkness fell and the fighting subsided, the 2nd Armoured Cavalry Regiment had effectively destroyed 2 Iraqi brigades. The overall Battle of 73 Easting, encompassing all the regiment's engagements that day, resulted in the destruction of approximately 160 tanks, 180 personnel carriers, and 12 artillery pieces. American casualties for the entire battle were minimal, and many of those resulted from friendly fire incidents rather than enemy action. The night that followed the battle was almost surreal for the American soldiers who had survived it. Burning vehicles illuminated the desert for miles in every direction. Secondary explosions continued as ammunition cooked off in destroyed tanks. Iraqi soldiers emerged from the darkness to surrender, hands raised, desperate to escape the inferno their positions had become. Eagle Troop collected approximately 250 prisoners that night. Many were wounded, all were demoralized. They had expected to fight American forces on roughly equal terms and had instead experienced complete annihilation. The few Iraqi officers among the prisoners expressed disbelief at what had happened. They had believed their T-72 tanks were capable of defeating the Abrams. They had been wrong. The American soldiers who accepted these surrenders displayed remarkable discipline. Despite the intensity of the combat they had just experienced, they treated prisoners humanely and provided medical attention to the wounded. This conduct reflected both their training and the leadership of officers like McMaster, who insisted on adherence to the laws of war even in the chaos of battle. The significance of the battle extended far beyond the desert where it was fought. Military observers around the world, particularly in the Soviet Union, watched the destruction of the Tawakalna Division with growing alarm. The T-72 had been the backbone of Soviet armoured forces for 2 decades. More than 25,000 had been built. Soviet military planners had believed the tank capable of defeating any Western opponent. They had exported it to allies around the world, and they had based their doctrine on its capabilities. 73 Eastings shattered those assumptions. The T-72 had proven vulnerable to a degree that Soviet analysts had not anticipated. Its lack of modern fire control systems, its inability to fight effectively at night, and its catastrophic ammunition storage design had combined to produce a disaster. Soviet military journals would later admit that the myth of Soviet armour superiority had been laid to rest in the Iraqi desert. In the months following the Gulf War, Soviet and later Russian military analysts conducted extensive studies of the T-72's performance. They acknowledged that the export versions used by Iraq lacked the advanced armor and fire control systems of frontline Soviet models. They also admitted that Iraqi crews had not received training comparable to what Soviet tankers underwent. But these explanations could not obscure the fundamental weaknesses the battle had exposed. Marshal Oleg Losik, the chief of Soviet tank forces, responded to critics who used the Gulf War to argue for military budget cuts. Writing in the army newspaper Red Star, Losik insisted that the Soviet Union must maintain absolute parity with the West. But his defensive tone revealed the depth of concern within the Soviet military establishment. A United States Army spokesperson later revealed that after the Cold War ended, American and German analysts had been able to examine Soviet-made T-72 tanks equipped with the latest Contact 5 explosive reactive armor. These tests showed that the most advanced Soviet models were far more capable than the export versions destroyed in Iraq. But the damage to the T-72's reputation had already been done. The contrast with American equipment was equally stark. The M1A1 Abrams had performed beyond expectations. Its thermal sights had provided decisive advantages in visibility. Its 120mm gun had proven capable of killing at ranges the enemy could not match. Its composite armor, incorporating depleted uranium in the M1A1HA variant, had provided protection that no Iraqi weapon could penetrate. The doctrine that had been developed to fight the Soviet Union had been validated against Soviet equipment. For H.R. McMaster, the battle was a defining moment. He would later write a detailed account of Eagle Troop's experience, hoping to provide insight into armored combat for future officers who might face similar challenges. The account was published shortly after the war and became required reading at military schools. He received the Silver Star for his actions on February 26th, but McMaster's career was just beginning. After the Gulf War, he returned to graduate school and earned a doctorate in American history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His dissertation examined the failures of American military and civilian leadership during the Vietnam War. The work was unflinching in its criticism of senior officers who had failed to provide honest assessments to their political superiors. Published as Dereliction of Duty in 1997, the book became a bestseller and required reading in military circles. The book established McMaster as an intellectual voice within the Army, someone willing to challenge conventional thinking even at risk to his own career. Some senior officers viewed his criticism of Vietnam-era generals as disrespectful. McMaster was passed over for promotion to brigadier general twice, an experience that many observers attributed to his willingness to speak uncomfortable truths. McMaster continued to serve in uniform, commanding units in Iraq and Afghanistan during the wars that followed September 11th. He developed a reputation as one of the Army's most innovative thinkers on counter-insurgency warfare. In 2005, his 3rd Armoured Cavalry Regiment achieved notable success in stabilizing the Iraqi city of Tal Afar using methods that emphasized protecting the population rather than simply killing insurgents. The Tal Afar operation demonstrated that McMaster had learned from his experience at 73 Easting, while also recognizing that different conflicts require different approaches. Against the Tawakalna division, overwhelming firepower had been appropriate. Against an insurgency embedded in a civilian population, such tactics would be counterproductive. McMaster adapted his methods to the situation he faced. Rising to the rank of Lieutenant General, McMaster was appointed National Security Advisor by President Donald Trump in February 2017. He served in that position until April 2018, providing strategic advice during a period of significant international tension. After retiring from the Army, he joined Stanford University's Hoover Institution as a senior fellow. The lessons of 73 Easting continued to influence American military thinking long after the battle ended. The Army's National Training Center created a detailed digital simulation of the engagement, allowing future officers to study the tactics that had proven so effective. The battle became a case study in the application of combined arms warfare and the exploitation of technological superiority. This simulation represented a pioneering effort in military education, using data gathered from after-action interviews and GPS tracking of vehicle movements. Army researchers recreated the battle in extraordinary detail. Students at military schools could fight through the engagement from McMaster's perspective, making the same decisions he had faced and seeing the consequences of alternative choices. The simulation also allowed analysts to explore what might have happened if conditions had been different. What if the sandstorm had cleared, allowing Iraqi tanks to use their optical sights? What if the Tawakalna division had been oriented to face the American approach? What if McMaster had halted at the 70 easting as ordered? These counterfactual analyses deepened understanding of why the battle unfolded as it did. The Tawakalna division was so thoroughly destroyed that it was disbanded after the war. The Republican Guard as a whole never recovered from the losses suffered during the 100 hours of ground combat. When American forces returned to Iraq in 2003, they faced an Iraqi military that was a shadow of its former self. 12 years of international sanctions had degraded Iraqi military readiness to a fraction of what it had been in 1991. Tank crews had not conducted live fire training in years. Equipment had not been properly maintained. The officer corps had been purged of anyone Saddam Hussein suspected of disloyalty. The military that American forces encountered in 2003 bore little resemblance to the one that had invaded Kuwait. But even the degraded Iraqi military of 2003 confirmed lessons from 73 easting. In one engagement near Mahmudiyah, south of Baghdad, M1A1 tanks destroyed 7 T-72s at point-blank range without suffering a single loss. The technological advantages that had proven decisive in 1991 remained decisive more than a decade later. The ground war that had begun on February 24th ended just 4 days later, on February 28th, when President George H.W. Bush declared a ceasefire. In 100 hours of combat, coalition forces had liberated Kuwait and destroyed the offensive capability of the fourth largest army in the world. American casualties totaled fewer than 150 killed in action, a fraction of what Pentagon planners had anticipated. Some military planners had predicted that casualties could reach into the tens of thousands. They based these estimates on the assumption that Iraqi forces would fight effectively, that chemical weapons might be employed, and that urban combat in Kuwait City would produce horrific losses. None of these scenarios materialized. The speed and completeness of the coalition victory transformed American thinking about military power. For 2 decades, the memory of Vietnam had haunted defense planning. Many Americans doubted whether their military could win a major war against a well-equipped adversary. The Gulf War erased those doubts. It demonstrated that the investments made during the Reagan administration in new weapons, training, and doctrine had produced the most capable military force in the world. Critics argued that the Iraqi army had been overrated, that the air campaign had done most of the work, and that the coalition's technological advantages made the outcome inevitable. There was truth in each of these points, but they did not diminish the achievement. American soldiers had been given superior equipment and trained to use it effectively. They had executed a complex operational plan with precision and aggressiveness. They had performed exactly as their leaders had hoped they would. The Battle of 73 Easting represented the culmination of decades of American military preparation. The doctrine developed to counter Soviet forces in Europe had proven effective against Soviet equipment in the Middle East. The training that had been refined through countless exercises in Germany had produced soldiers capable of executing complex operations under the most demanding conditions. The equipment that had been designed to fight the Cold War had demonstrated its superiority in the only true test that matters. For the soldiers of Eagle Troop who charged into the teeth of the Iraqi defences that February afternoon, the battle was something more personal. It was a validation of everything they had trained for, proof that their skills and courage could overcome any enemy. They had faced the Republican Guard, the best soldiers Saddam Hussein could field, and they had destroyed them utterly. Staff Sergeant John McReynolds, a Scout Section Sergeant in Eagle Troop, later recalled that during the battle, his crew did not need to be told what to do. It just kind of came natural. Lieutenant Timothy Gauthier, one of the platoon leaders, described the action as almost businesslike. Years of training had made combat an extension of reflex. The 9 tanks of Eagle Troop had achieved what military theorists would study for decades. They had engaged a numerically superior enemy in prepared defensive positions and annihilated him in less than half an hour. They had demonstrated that technology, training, and leadership could overcome even the most daunting odds. The men who fought at 73 Easting went on to various fates. Some remained in the army and rose to senior positions. Others left the service and pursued civilian careers. McMaster became one of the most prominent military intellectuals of his generation. The battle that had consumed 23 minutes of their lives would define the rest of their careers. Many of the soldiers who served under McMaster in Eagle Troop have spoken about the experience in the years since. They describe a sense of confidence that came from thorough preparation, trust in their equipment, and faith in their leadership. They also acknowledge the element of fortune that allowed them to catch the enemy by complete surprise. A different set of circumstances might have produced a different outcome. Staff Sergeant Craig Coke, McMaster's gunner, demonstrated extraordinary skill during those critical seconds when the battle began. His ability to acquire and engage targets rapidly, to transition from one enemy vehicle to the next without hesitation, reflected years of training and natural ability. Coke would later be recognized for his performance, though he deflected credit to the crew that supported him. Lieutenant Timothy Gauthier, who commanded 3rd Platoon, observed that his soldiers performed almost as if they were on a training exercise. The tactics they employed had been rehearsed so many times that they became automatic. There was no time for fear during the battle itself. The fear came later, when they had time to reflect on what had happened and what might have gone wrong. More than 3 decades have passed since those 9 tanks crested that rise in the Iraqi desert. The Cold War that shaped the doctrine and equipment used that day has ended. The Soviet Union that built the T-72s destroyed at 73 Easting no longer exists. New threats have emerged, and new technologies have transformed the character of warfare. Drones, precision-guided munitions, cyber weapons, and artificial intelligence have altered the battlefield in ways that the soldiers at 73 Easting could not have imagined. Some military theorists question whether tanks remain relevant in an age when a single soldier with an anti-tank missile can destroy the most advanced armoured vehicle. The conflicts in Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere have demonstrated both the continued utility of armour and its vulnerability to modern weapons. But the fundamental principles demonstrated that February afternoon remain valid. Superior training produces soldiers who can function under extreme stress. Superior technology provides advantages that an enemy cannot overcome through numbers alone. Superior leadership makes the difference between hesitation and decisive action in the critical seconds when battles are won or lost. H.R. McMaster understood these principles when he ordered his gunner to fire on that first T-72. His soldiers understood them when they executed his orders with precision and aggression. The American military establishment understood them when it invested decades of effort in preparing for a war that seemed inevitable. The Soviets learned these lessons too late. The generals in Moscow who watched the destruction of their equipment realized that their theories of armored warfare had failed the test of combat. The myth of Soviet tank superiority died in the Iraqi desert. consumed by the fires that burned in the hulls of T-72s from one end of the Tawakalna Division's line to the other. That is the true significance of 73 Easting, not just a battle won, but a validation of an entire approach to warfare, not just an enemy defeated, but a demonstration of what free societies can achieve when they commit themselves to military excellence. 9 tanks, 23 minutes, 28 kills. No American losses. Those numbers tell a story that military professionals still study today. They tell the story of what happens when preparation meets opportunity, when training meets combat, when the best soldiers in the world meet an enemy who believed himself their equal. The Iraqi Republicans' guards discovered the truth that afternoon. Soviet military observers watching from a distance understood the implications. The American soldiers who climbed out of their tanks when the shooting stopped knew what they had accomplished. They had fought the last great tank battle of the 20th century, and they had won. If you found this account meaningful, please like this video. It helps us share more essential chapters from military history. Subscribe to stay connected with these stories. Each preserves lessons that remain relevant today. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans continents and generations, united by commitment to understanding how history shapes the present. Thank you for watching.